Hello and welcome to the Euranet Plus video debate. During the lockdown, we're talking to politicians, journalists, and citizens about the big issues during COVID-19. And in this week's episode, we're going to be talking about the pandemic's effect on globalization. My name is Dave Keating, and today I'm joined by three MEPs, members of the European Parliament: German MEP Anna Cavazzini from the Green Group, Irish MEP Barry Andrews from the Renew Group of Liberals, and Greek MEP Anna Michelle Asimakopoulou from the center-right EPP Group. Thank you all so much for joining us this week. And we're also joined by Luisa Santos, Deputy Director General for the Industry Association Business Europe. So we've now entered a recovery phase in this crisis. Lockdown restrictions are slowly being eased and governments are trying to jumpstart the economy. But there's a lot of questions being asked about what the new economic model should be and what lessons there are to be learned from this whole crisis. Europe's traumatic experience of not being able to source essential medical supplies during the initial phase of this outbreak has really stuck in people's minds, and it's led to questions over whether the EU is over-reliant on imports, particularly from China. People are asking if globalization went too far and whether we need to reshore industry. Some of these questions are being asked by people you might not expect. The EU's Internal Market Commissioner, Thierry Breton, recently said Europe may have gone too far in globalization. French President Macron and even German Chancellor Merkel are starting to say Europe needs to rethink its economic sovereignty. So has the virus exposed globalization's flaws? Luisa, let's turn to you first, since you're speaking as the voice of business in Europe and you deal in particularly with these issues of international trade. Some are saying the crisis has exposed the risks that were always inherent in offshoring manufacturing. From a business perspective, are they identifying the problem correctly?
Well, the virus is an extreme situation where we had a huge spike in demand for certain products related to healthcare sector. And this demand was extreme around the world. So there was definitely a lot of pressure also on supply. So it doesn't mean that the globalization is responsible for this situation. What we do see is that for the future, we will need to be less dependent on one or two suppliers. That's clear. So we will need diversification. But of course, we also need to be very coherent in the sense that we are not going to be self-sufficient in Europe. We will not be able to produce everything in Europe. So we will need also to take this into account. We need to remain open to the idea that we will need to import. So it's not that we're going to be producing everything in Europe. And if we really want to attract more production to Europe, it's not by decree that we're going to do this. It's by creating the necessary conditions for companies to feel that they have the best environment to compete in Europe. For instance, support more innovation and research, making sure that we have the right infrastructure. I mean, this crisis has also shown how important it is to have a good infrastructure, for instance, on digital, to make sure that business and citizens continue to adjust to this new reality. So there's a whole set of conditions that make production come back to Europe.
Well, Anna Cavazzo, I mean, you've talked a lot about what the new post-crisis economy could look like, particularly from a green perspective, but also from a kind of fair trade perspective. What do you think the experience of this pandemic has shown us so far about globalization? And do you think it does bolster the argument for fair trade?
Yeah, we could see with the COVID-19 crisis that some effects of the globalization are really negative. We talked about already about fragile and too long supply chains, but we're also seeing different problems. For example, looking at Malaysia, where 65% of the medical gloves are being produced, and migrant workers from Bangladesh are basically working under really fierce conditions, even forced labor. We also see that the workers in Bangladesh were the first that lost their jobs because of the textile industry just canceling all the demands. So the COVID-19 crisis showed the downsides of globalization. And I would say I see three areas where we need to act. One is definitely trying to reshore some of the industries. Of course, not everything will be produced in Europe, that's clear, but some of the strategic industries. Second, we need a better supply chain management. I'm fighting for mandatory due diligence legislation. Commissioner Reinders announced exactly that 2 weeks ago, that next year the Commission will come up with a proposal of how to better and in a more sustainable manner manage supply chains. And third, I think the next crisis is already ahead. It's the climate crisis, and that's why we need to really also adapt our trade policy, our international economic policy to climate change, meaning putting the Paris Agreement as at the center of all the trade agreements.
Barry, let's turn to you over in Ireland. There's already been rising sentiment against free trade. We've heard it for a while now from populist movements across the world, even before the pandemic hit. So do you think that the fact that we live in a globalized free trade economy, has that hurt us in the virus response?
Well, I think, first of all, trade has come into this crisis in a weak enough state in the first place. And populists will naturally look to protectionism as a response to try to generate energy for their political ideology. But the difference now, I suppose, is that populists are actually in power, and they're in power in some very significant countries. And what we now are seeing as a result of COVID is a limit to the attractiveness of populism. And people are looking for expertise. People are looking for public health experts, immunologists, virologists, epidemiologists, rather than the simplistic arguments that populists put forward. Having said all of that, I agree with Anna that what we need is a much fairer model for our global economy. We have to fight against those who would limit free movement of people, as in migration. We have to defend the benefits of free trade, but equally, we need to make sure that sustainability is stitched into any free trade agreements we have, into the rules around the World Trade Organization, and in particular in the area of medicines. Because right now, all of us are fighting to make sure that we have vaccines, we have treatments, we have diagnostics, but equally to try and distribute those fairly when they come on stream is going to be a critical issue. So we need to make sure that we challenge populists where we find it, but also we have to make sure the system that emerges, as you said earlier, is a fair system, is transparent and serves the people and deals with questions of inequality that people are genuinely bringing up.
Anna Michelle, Louisa mentioned that Europe, of course, can't be completely self-sustainable, right? There are just resources that don't exist here. So are there critical industries that the EU should be thinking about moving back to Europe? And if so, which ones? Would it be enough to maybe just diversify the sourcing of those critical industries, or should they really come back to Europe?
Right. Well, thank you, Dave. I mean, Louisa's right. I mean, I think that self-sufficiency is clearly an illusion. So I think a realistic option is what we're calling trying to achieve, and a realistic goal is what we're calling strategic autonomy. Now, that may require reshoring certain industries, but mostly it requires striking a balance, and that would be a balance between reshoring and a balance between having diversified supply chains that are robust and resilient enough so that we don't go through experiences like we just went through, which were sort of scary, not being sure that we have what we need to deal with such a health crisis. I think the other thing we need to focus on is that this strategic autonomy needs to keep us open to the rest of the world. So I think shutting down and protectionism are not the solution, just because globalization has let us down in certain things. Now, which sectors? That's a very difficult question. It depends on the criteria one decides to use. But clearly, materials are a sector, and clearly infrastructure for technology and digital is a critical sector. Clearly, health supplies are a critical sector. I don't have to say that, but I think we have a ways to go until we define which sectors are critical and identify where we can achieve what we're calling open strategic autonomy.
Obviously, the elephant in the room here is China and big concerns about Europe being over-dependent on China in particular. And there's even talk about whether China should be limited in terms of what it can purchase in Europe. How do you guys think that this whole experience is going to affect the EU's relationship with China? Louisa, I mean, what are businesses telling you about how they feel about China these days?
Well, the discussion on China is not new. I mean, we released in January our comprehensive strategy towards rebalancing our bilateral relations. So for European business, it's clear that we need to change the pattern of our relationship with China. We need to make our relations stronger, but we also need to make our relation fairer. This means that we need to find ways of addressing the state-centric model that China has. Of course, it will probably not change, but we'll need to make sure that because this model is creating market distortions, we have means of leveling the playing field, both in Europe, but also in China. That's why we're negotiating a bilateral investment agreement, but also around the world. And above all, as Europe, we need to change our approach towards China. We need to be more strategic. We need to have clear objectives and that these objectives are measurable. And above all, we need to speak with one voice. So the idea is not to decouple from China, but is to make sure that our companies, European companies, benefit from the same opportunities that Chinese companies do.
Anna Michelle, the leader of your political group, Manfred Weber, has had some strong statements on this in terms of how the EU should be reevaluating its relationship with China. What do you think is the best way for the EU to be thinking about China right now?
Well, I think we need to be wary. First of all, I think we need to call an elephant, not a spade a spade. I mean, we need to acknowledge that it's time to be wary about what China is doing. There's some very valid questions about whether China has been transparent throughout this process. It's clear that we have dependencies on China that are worrisome for Europe. And I think that we need to be very wary about whether they will use this crisis as a Trojan horse in order to take over a lot of very strategic industries that they've been attacking through these practices for years. Therefore, I agree with Manfred Weber that we're certainly, we have to look at screening their investments, but we may have to reach the point of just saying for a little while, no more Chinese investments. Having said that, we need to be, our supply chains will clearly have to be in Asia, but the playing field there, we have to make sure that it's a level playing field for all of us.
Anna Cavazzini, do you think there is a risk in all of this talk about Europe being protected from China, that we get into a kind of xenophobic game here? What's the balance that needs to be struck between legitimate concerns about where things are sourced and edging into a more populist argument?
Yeah, clearly one dangerous development that I'm seeing before I get to your question is that the EU and the member states are very, very schizophrenic when it comes to China, because on the one hand, the talk is all about trade defense and trying to defend our strategic industries like from China, from getting bought off by China. And on the other hand, the EU is just negotiating an investment protection agreement which will give Chinese companies, which are mostly state-owned, a huge power in suing European governments. So for me, this is the first big contradiction that we are seeing in EU policies towards China. And secondly, as an answer to your question, I would say, in general, you are right. It's very, very important to always distinguish between like the government policies and the people, and not developing such a general China xenophobia. We saw it a little bit with the virus. A lot of people with Asian descent in Europe and also in the US got threatened by racism, and you could see what this anti-China rhetoric is already doing to a lot of individuals who look like being from China. And this is, of course, not a good development.
Barry, I mean, when we're talking about China, and measures that could be taken to protect European businesses, or just in general when we're talking about the new way to reshore certain industries. A lot of the talk is what the EU can do, maybe with a new industrial strategy, for instance. What are the limits and benefits of doing this type of thing at EU level, whether it's blocking Chinese acquisitions through competition policy, maybe, or reshoring certain industries? Is this something that's best done at EU level, do you think, or is this more of a national competence?
Well, is it best done at all? I think reshoring, it has to be distinguished from diversifying supply chains, and relocalizing supply chains has a limit, because it'll just add in cost and inefficiency. Diversification is a very different thing, and we want to make, for example, if we felt that there was too great reliance on Chinese exports, then we have a free trade agreement with Vietnam. We have other opportunities to diversify our supply chain in that way. So I don't think it's as straightforward as that. But I do have I just kind of agree with Anna in the point that to a certain extent, this idea of open strategic autonomy is what we call an oxymoron. It is trying to have your cake and eat it in some ways, because autonomy means freedom to act independently. But having an open strategic autonomy pulls in the other direction. And I would have some serious concerns that we are bringing protectionism into the structure of the European economic model in many ways, whether it's through FDI screening, whether it's through an industrial policy at European or national level, or whether it is through an attitude to China, which is I think quite negative, and I am concerned about the impact this is having at a social level, and the many Asian people that live in Europe who are entitled to the same treatment as everybody else. So it is a concern for me. I think protectionism is on the rise at a structural level within the EU, and that is something that we really have to be very vigilant about.
Louisa, how would you respond to that? Because there are a lot of European businesses calling for protection from Chinese businesses, but again, like Barry is saying, when you're looking at a global level and when governments are really thinking about how to protect the economy at a global level, is there a conflict there?
No, for us, I mean, having an industrial strategy does not mean that we're going to become protectionists. We very much, and this is one of the major points in our recovery plan, the plan of business Europe presented recently, we want Europe to remain an open market and an open economy, and we want Europe actually to play a leadership role in this moment where so many are questioning multilateral solutions. I mean, this crisis is a global crisis, and it's a global challenge that merits a global response. It's not by each country trying to get its own nationalistic approach that we're going to sort out a crisis like COVID-19, on the contrary. So we have an interest in global cooperation and making sure that we continue to support a reform World Trade Organization, especially now, and that we defend rules-based trade. On the other hand, what we cannot continue to do in Europe is just to think that the market elsewhere functions exactly as it functions in Europe. It doesn't. And even in Europe, the fact that so many companies from around the world can have free access to our market while we cannot compete in the same conditions in their markets, I mean, this cannot continue. But this doesn't mean that we close our market. It means that we need to continue to open new markets. At the same time, we need to use the instruments that we have and allow us for a better level playing field in Europe. This is what we think would be a good approach for a good industrial strategy as well.
Well, certainly these are issues that are going to continue to be discussed at policy level in Brussels, and particularly in the European Parliament. So that's all the time we have for today's discussion. I'll leave the MEPs to continue to debate these big issues as we think about redeveloping the European economy in a post-COVID world. So thank you all so much for the panelists for participating and for the viewers for following along. Take care.